Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Renewable Energy and Natural Resources session. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Mrs. Victoria Girard, to open the session. Mrs. Victoria Girard, the screen.
Many thanks to all of you to attend this session today. We have three presentations, and we'll start with Majah presenting on extreme weather events and household welfare, followed by Sola on macroeconomic impacts of fiscal incentives for renewable energy before my own presentation. Please write down all your questions in the chat and we will read them out loud at the end of the session for each of the presenters. Majah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Do you see it? Let me just, okay. Okay, hold on. Okay, good evening everyone, or good day, wherever you may be. First of all, many thanks to the International Economic Association for the opportunity to share our research with you today. I've been really looking forward to go to Bali and meet everyone, but nonetheless, I'm just as glad to be here and participate in this online conference. This is a collaborative effort, this research, with colleagues from the Department of Economics at Ateneo de Manila University and the Manila Observatory, whose names you see on the screen. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project that is funded by IDRC Canada. So the title of our research is Extreme Weather Events and Households Welfare in the Formal and Informal Sector. So just to give a context, situated in the tropics and the Pacific, the Philippines is vulnerable to extreme weather events such as super typhoons, storm surges, intense flooding, among others. The World Risk Report has consistently ranked the Philippines as third among the top 15 most exposed countries in the world, next to Vanuatu and Tonga. In 2019 to 2020, the country registered an improvement, ranking number 9. Now, extreme events are just natural hazards. However, they are elevated into a disaster when they overwhelm human capacity, create destruction and damage, and cost human lives. Disasters caused by natural hazards have become a pressing development concern because they can negate development gains, they can push any household into poverty, and exacerbate inequality. Now, why are we interested in knowing the impact of these disasters between the formal and informal sector? The literature defined formal sector to be those that are subject to taxation and regulatory law, while the informal sector is largely outside of it, making it implicitly illegal. However, there is not a sharp divide between the formal and informal sector. Nonetheless, a differentiation is useful as this can serve as a guide in the improvements of statistical databases and formulation and implementation of policies. We also note that informality aggravates the socioeconomic cost incurred by households during disasters. They don't have access to health insurance. They have lack of access to formal financial instruments to cope with risk. Thus, disaster can increase the vulnerability of informal households to remain informal while also increasing the risk that formal households will fall into informality. Now, with climatic changes that are expected to result in shifting precipitation patterns and potentially but slightly stronger cyclones affecting the country, understanding the impact of extreme weather events on the welfare of the formal and informal sectors is crucial for the appropriate design of policy instrument and social protection. Now, we take the number of extreme rainfall days as a proxy for these extreme weather events. So our objective is to assess and differentiate the impact of extreme rainfall days on the welfare of the formal and informal sectors of the economy using household survey data. Specifically, we will be using the Family Income and Expenditure Survey and the Labor Force Survey, which is a nationally representative data that is conducted by the Philippine Statistics Authority. Okay, so to define the number of extreme rainfall day, we utilized a satellite-derived daily rainfall from the Tropical Rainfall Measuring Mission multi-satellite precipitation analysis dataset from 1998 to 2018, so over 2 decades. Its spatial coverage is about 25-kilometer grid resolution, which addresses the constraint posed by the limited number of weather stations in the Philippines. So in a day, we define it to be an extreme rainfall day if the rainfall registered for that day exceeds the 95th percentile of daily rainfall over the 2-decade period. So here is a picture of that. Now, each year, we distinguish municipalities, okay, as areas experiencing normal or extreme rainfall. A municipality is tagged under extreme when the number of extreme rainfall days for the year exceeds the 75th percentile of the annual number of extreme rainfall days across the 2-decade period. So here is a map of the extreme areas experiencing extreme rainfall for 2005, 2008, 2011, and 2014. These are a previous year's mapping with the data that we will be using for the household survey, because we note that the impact of this disaster is captured by the data the following year. Now, who are the households in the formal and informal sector in the Philippines? We also note that the Philippine Statistics Authority does not issue official statistical counts of formal and informal households in the country. However, it defines the informal sector as those households unincorporated enterprises. So we use this definition as a basis in identifying households in the informal sector using the labor force survey. So from 2006 to 2015, we note that the share of the informal households decreased from 43% to 36%. But for these 2 years, 2006 to 29, the proportion of informal households is higher, and then we see a reversal in 2012 and 2015. Now, informal households are also mostly in the rural areas, and most of them are poor. A household is considered poor if its total income is less than the provincial poverty threshold set by the government. So this table highlights the intersection of the informality and poverty in the Philippines. So since we are comparing the welfare of the households in the formal and informal sector, just a simple t-test provide a striking results. So we see here that the income and per capita expenditure of informal households are lower than the formal, but they are much lower when the informal households are living or are in the areas that are experiencing extreme rainfall, and the difference are all significant. So now we go to the formal examination of the difference or of the impact of these extreme rainfall days on the welfare of the formal and informal households. Now, the simplest approach is to just do OLS and then include a dummy variable, whether the household is formal or informal. However, doing OLS leads to a biased estimate due to the assumption that informality is exogenously determined when in fact it can be potentially endogenous. Households belonging to informal sector may have systematically different characteristics and choose to be in the informal sector due to its expected benefits. They are thereby also influencing their income. So to address this endogeneity and selectivity bias, we estimate a switching regression model by using maximum likelihood methods. So a household faces a choice between informal and informal sector. Then the difference in the net benefits determine the sector of choice. So this is governed by the system of equation having two welfare equation, one for the informal and the other one is for the formal. And then this is the selection equation. The Y here would be either the per capita income or per capita expenditure. The D stands for the disaster, which in our case is the number of extreme rainfall days, lag up to 3 years. The X is just the vector of households characteristics. Z include the X and other identifying variable for this selection equation. Now, we do not observe this decision-making variable of the household, but the observed value outcome of this I star is given by 1 if I star is positive and 0 otherwise. So the XS or the vector of household characteristics include sex, age, square of age, marital status, educational attainment of the household head, as well as household size. And then the sector selection variable, this is the Z, includes the urban and rural municipality being poor or non-poor, and the household characteristics. So we pulled our data for 4 years and implemented both OLS also and the switching regression using the move stay command in Stata. So let me give you the full result. This is the OLS. So we use real per capita expenditure and real per capita income as the outcome variable. This is the selection equation, and this is the welfare equation. Let me magnify this table so that we can all see. First, the result of the OLS estimate. It shows that households have lower income and expenditure given by the negative coefficient. Being informal relative to formal sector decreases expenditure and income by around 7%, holding other things constant. But we know that this is biased because it assumes that informality is exogenous. Now, going to the switching regression results. So we have here the selection equation. This gives us the answer to the question, what factors influence household to be informal? Now, being poor significantly affects the likelihood that households will be informal. And being considered as urban inversely affects the likelihood that households will be informal. And then going to the results of the full information maximum likelihood on the welfare, the estimates show that extreme rainfall adversely affects welfare, here using expenditure as our outcome variable. Extreme rainfall days significantly lowers expenditure of households in the formal and informal sector by 16.2% and 10.6% respectively. Using income as welfare indicator, the negative effects is slightly bigger at 17.2 and 11.9% for the informal households. Now, note that we lag our disaster variable or the extreme number of rainfall days up to 3 years. We note that here, the coefficient are all negative and significant, with the magnitude getting smaller the earlier the experience of extreme rainfall. Now, this result is striking as we will graph it. Here we have the dotted line representing the effect on the formal sector for the 3-year and the solid line for the informal sector. The dotted line is more negative, indicating that the impact on the formal sector is much higher, and then the slope of this line can be interpreted as the speed of recovery, so that we know that the formal sector recovers faster than the informal sector. Now, what is the takeaway from these results? Households in the formal sector has larger income and therefore has more to lose than the households in the informal sector. However, the adverse impact to the informal households may be irreversible given their weak capability to recover and their limited ability to smooth out consumption even during days with normal rainfall. Now, further differentiating the impact of these extreme rainfall days on the welfare of the informal and formal households. One might...
Just to be sure, you have 1 minute left.
Yes, this is my second to the last slide. Thank you. One might compare the welfare of these informal households that actually did go to the informal sector and the income of the or expenditure of the formal households that did go to the formal sector. But that comparison might be misleading. The proper comparison should be these cells A and C, which is the actual versus the counterfactual. So households who are in the informal sector have income lower by 1,109 compared to a counterfactual case had they chose the formal sector. And similarly, cells B and D, where the counterfactual of formal household is had they chosen the informal sector. So as a concluding remarks, households, regardless of which sector they belong, reels from the negative effects of experiencing extreme rainfall from 3 years ago up to a year ago. Weak capability to recover and the limited ability to smooth out consumption even during days with normal rainfall makes extreme weather events adversely potent for the welfare of the informal households. Targeted social protection coverage to households near the poverty line can help soften the blow of a weather shocks. This includes improving the informal sector access to opportunities for smoothing consumption and awareness or education campaign regarding the impact of disasters. Thank you very much, and I look forward to receiving your comments and suggestions at the end. Thank you. Victor?
Many thanks, Maha, for this presentation and great timing. I guess, so please do write at any point, any question in the chat, and we'll take them towards the end. I believe there were a couple of questions that were either to Maha or to all presenters.
Yes, yes, Victor, thanks. Do I read the question? So this is a question from Maria Annie Adriana. So thank you very much for this question. As said that lower expenditure of formal and informal households during extreme rainfall from 16.2% and 10.6% respectively. Can you observe whether the expenditure getting lower due to activities they can perform during the rainfall? In the Philippines, there are two climate characteristics, the wet and dry season. However, our data is annually, so for 1 year. Thus, we cannot observe those activities that are done or they are not able to do when there is during rainfall. However, we have this data. Let me just share it quickly. Also from the FIES, I wasn't able to share this earlier. We also differentiate according to sources of income, non-agriculture and agriculture, and according to type of expenditure. Here, we note that except for agriculture income, the informal households have higher income than the households in the formal sector. So we know that this is expected since agriculture is dependent on rainfall and a substantial proportion of the informal households are engaged in agriculture. But other than this one, we cannot identify the activities that are being done during rainfall days. Thanks, Maria.
If I may follow up, Maha, I had the question just also on your work. I was wondering, like, I do believe extreme rainfall events are very important. How do they relate to other type of extreme events? And I'm thinking in particular about winds or typhoon. Is it something that can be an issue? And does it come correlated with the rainfall? How does the two relate?
Yes, okay. So actually, let me share that screen, okay? Hold on. Let me find it, okay. Okay. So I was working with climate scientists. So actually, this is an eye-opener. In the beginning, we said, just give us the data and we will so normally in the literature, you take the extreme rainfall to be as a weather shock and you just take the tail of a normal distribution. So when we showed this to the climate scientists, they said, that cannot be an extreme rainfall or a shock. So that's why we had to define it like this. But we note that because of So this is already the greater than the 95th percentile of the daily rainfall across 2 decades. But nonetheless, this one, there are like monsoon rains or we have typhoons that doesn't have rain. So that this measure does not include those typhoons that doesn't have rain. But it can include like the prolonged monsoon rains. Okay, so we don't have the typhoon, but it really create it was really a disaster, especially when it happens in Manila, where you have a very densely populated area. So that's the thing that this measure cannot capture. So it's a different measure when you say typhoon, because typhoon is with regarding to the wind speed. Thanks, Victor.
And should we move maybe to the question that was directed to Soraya before there's a more general question that we can discuss at the end? I believe, Soraya, there was at least one question from what I'm seeing here. asking that the incentive on renewable energy has been reducing by almost 12%, but not necessarily decreasing the use of fossil fuel. Would the government foresee to add fossil fuel tax while giving more subsidy in renewable energy to support the shifting to renewable energy?
Right,
And there's a second question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you can go ahead.
No, go ahead. Maybe
Okay,
it's easier, clearer to answer one by one.
Thank you, Maria Eni. Thank you for your question. I think my understanding of the first question is you're trying to understand why the policy leads to a reduction in renewable energy price by up to 12%, but there's not necessarily a decrease in the use of fossil fuel. And probably you're asking a follow-up question that would the government propose to add a fossil fuel tax in addition to the subsidy? Well, I think if you look at the result I presented, I think one of the things we found is that the prices of renewable energy reduces because, of course, subsidy will definitely reduce the cost of production, right? But we found out that instead of renewable energy serving as a kind of like substitution for fossil fuel, we see that as renewable energy is as the use of renewable energy is increasing, fossil fuel is supposed to reduce. But in that case, we also find that in some sectors, fossil fuel also increases, right? So that substitution effect that we are expecting, particularly in terms of climate change mitigation, is not there. So that could be attributed to the fact that, of course, the economy is expanding. As a result of the economy expanding, there might also be need for more energy consumption. And the increase in renewable energy that we observed might not be enough to compensate for that increase in demand for overall energy. That is one. Then secondly, in terms of whether the government could impose fossil fuel tax, well, practically that might be possible, but in terms of politically, that might not be very feasible because I think in Nigeria, fossil fuel is subsidized, and removing the subsidy itself has always been a challenge. There have been a lot of political protests. There have been political protests. There have been opposition. So I do not foresee. Of course, that might make some very good public policy or economic policy, but politically or realistically, I don't see the government doing that, imposing tax on fossil fuel. I think politically, I'm not sure there's any Nigerian government that wants to do that at the moment. So I think the other question you asked is, does the research, does it lead to a reduction in CO2 emission? Yes, I think one of the results I presented shows that when the subsidy is financed, by fiscal deficit, it leads to a reduction in CO2 emission by 4%. But when it is financed by adjusting government expenditure, the emission reduces by 7.3%. But the challenge there is we may not necessarily look at the second scenario and think that is better because the emission reduction is higher. Because if you look at some of the other results I presented, we saw that the second scenario leads to reduction in household welfare, reduction in economic growth, right? So of course, if economic growth reduces, if household consumption and welfare reduces, you can expect that emission will reduce. But in terms of climate change mitigation, I don't think that's the kind of emission reduction we are looking at. We don't want to reduce CO2 emission at the expense of economic growth or at the expense of household welfare, right? I think the idea of climate change mitigation is as much as possible that we want to address these environmental issues. We also want to try to balance them with economic growth, with welfare. So I think the research reported the impact on CO2 emission, and the idea is just that when the subsidy is financed by deficit, I think the CO2 emission reduces, but not that much. Thank you for your question, Marianne.
Thank you for the question and answer. So yeah, there was also a question from Majah Ravago on the case of my presentation, asking about the correlation of my research, the corruption level and the Gini ratio in these countries. We do not observe how this corruption level or Gini answer to the presence of the mines, but this has been done in other works. what we can look at in our case is whether this level of corruption or inequalities can be a mediating factor or increase, maybe magnifies the effect that we observe. And it is not the case in the case of corruption. It's something that we have tried indeed to split the sample, say, by whether the country has a higher or lower level of corruption, and we do not observe any such heterogeneity. In terms of the Gini, we do not try directly to Gini, but it's a bit the idea behind looking if there's a heterogeneity by the group being initially poorer than the average group in the country. And we do observe here that this really magnifies the effect indeed. So thanks a lot for your question. I think it's really interesting. And there's, maybe we have time for closing the discussion with a more general question by Farida Nur Aziza, which was a question for all of the three of us, but I have the feeling that Maha and Sola are going to be so much more experts to answer on it than I am, but we can still discuss it all together, which has to say amazing presentation from all presenters. I would like to ask all presenters if they have any indexes that can reflect environmental problem per capita, and whether such environmental indexes should be indicated and should be included as indicators of poverty as well.
Maya, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure what environmental index Farida is referring to, but there is one like the Green Net National Product, which takes into account the depreciation of natural capital to be included as a measure of welfare. So that may be one. Maybe Sola can add additional.
Yeah, I think what came to my mind is from my understanding, I think so far most research use greenhouse gas emission per capita. I think that is more or less what is commonly used in the literature. And I think the other part of the question also said, do you think environmental index should be included as indicator of poverty as well? I think yes, that is extremely important, because in the context of the Global Agenda 2030, I think we are not only focusing on poverty reduction, we're also looking at sustainable poverty reduction, sustainable development, looking at how poverty reduction impacts environmental quality and how environmental quality also affects poverty reduction. So I think it's extremely important that environmental index or indicators are included in the measurement of poverty.
I guess I agree with Sola on the notion that indeed this notion of environmental poverty or quality is a really important part of poverty, in the sense that living in a polluted environment will have very bad in the medium run health consequences, right? So I feel like if it would be maybe a more complete version of the Human Development Index that had been developed by Amartya Sen, where you have this notion of education, income poverty, and health. And if you have environmental issue in time T where you live, you will face this in terms of health in the longer run. So maybe that might be a way to include it. The operationalization of this demands work. That's a full research agenda that you're opening.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's all.
Right? Do you have? Do you want to say a few closing words, Maha and Sola, before we close the section? I believe we have 1 minute left before it ends.
Yeah, let me quickly just want to thank everyone for attending this session. I think we really appreciate your questions and your comments, and it's a pleasure presenting this work and meeting all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure to meet you and discuss with you today.
Yeah, hope to see you all in person.
Yes, fingers crossed the next time is in person. It would be much even nicer.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, bye.
Have a great day or evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.